Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you, Amaroq, for that reminder. And thank you both of you for being here today. My name is Samantha Bruegger, and I am the Executive Director of Washington Wildlife First, a nonprofit dedicated exclusively to reforming the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Washington Wildlife First believes that the department should manage Washington's iconic species for all Washingtonians and prioritize conservation over consumption. And the center was kind enough to host this webinar on their platform. So I want to say a big thank you to the Center for Biological Diversity for hosting this. Prior to this role, I was lucky enough to work on a series of state wolf planning guides and petition rules for Washington's wolves while working on wildlife coexistence across the Western United States. My educational background and early career focused on public policy and governmental affairs. I came to know and appreciate wolves at a young age, and after symbolically adopting a member of the Sawtooth Pack, I was a wolf advocate for life. Much to my parents' dismay, this meant that as a child, I was playing a tape of wolves howling every night while I fell asleep. Wolves are just part of who I am, and they're the reason I'm so excited to introduce two women who know far more about wolves than I ever will, Claire Loebs Davis and Amaroq Weiss. And they're both who I turn to for wolf wisdom. So I'll introduce both of them, and then we can dive into a series of questions. And feel free to use the Q&A buttons within the webinar function, and I'll also be looking at that throughout. And I'll bring them up to the panelists. If I can fit them in, I'll try to answer some myself. And I also will try to leave a little space at the end or towards the end for any prior questions, but we definitely have a lot to cover today. Amaroq Weiss is a senior wolf advocate with the Center for Biological Diversity. She's a biologist and a former attorney. Amaroq has worked in wolf recovery and conservation advocacy for the Northern Rockies, Alaska, the Southwest, Pacific West, and at the federal level for the past 25 years. At present, her work focuses chiefly on wolf issues in West Coast states, the Northeastern United States, and at the federal level. Amaroq was an appointed representative in the two separate processes in Oregon and California to draft those states' wolf conservation and management plans. She is frequently interviewed for print, radio, and television coverage of wolf issues, and is the author, co-author, and editor of multiple publications on wolf conservation, wolf recovery, and state wolf planning processes. The organization for which she works, the Center for Biological Diversity, is a national nonprofit conservation organization with more than 1.7 million members and supporters that works to protect endangered species in wild places. Claire Loebs Davis is the managing partner of Animal and Earth Advocates, a Seattle area law firm that advocates for domestic animals, fish, and wildlife, and the environment. She is also one of the founders and the board president of my organization, Washington Wildlife First. After a clerkship on the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, Claire worked as a legal strategist for Best Friends Animal Society and the No More Homeless Pets movement. Claire then went on to be a securities litigator, but she continued to take wildlife cases on the side, including representing Sea Shepherd Conservation Society and its litigation against Japan's whaling program. In 2019, Claire left a partnership at Lane Powell in Seattle to start Animal and Earth Advocates. Claire specializes in state-based wildlife litigation and has sued the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife 10 times, which included 5 lawsuits to challenge its wolf management policies. Last year, Claire was a co-counsel in the Wisconsin wolf case that stopped the fall 2021 wolf hunt in that state. However, Claire has long recognized that lawsuits alone cannot improve wildlife management. So last year, she helped found Washington Wildlife First, the nonprofit dedicated to reforming state fish and wildlife management. And so I think I've talked enough. I'm glad I can start handing it over to both of you. I'd like to dive in by starting with, let's talk about the title for today's webinar. What do you mean by better than Idaho isn't good enough?
I'll go first, Claire. I imagine many of you who are attending this evening have been following what's been going on in Idaho and with its immediate neighbors, Montana and Wyoming. If you have, you know that in the past 2 years, Idaho and Montana have enacted barbaric laws that greatly expand how, when, and where wolves can be killed. In the past 2 years, they have enacted laws and regulations that result in nearly unlimited trapping, removal of quotas of how many wolves could be killed in any individual game management unit, or about how many wolves any individual hunter or trapper could kill, allowing the use of neck hold strangulation snares, paying bounties to people for killing wolves, and allowing people to chase wolves in snowmobiles to exhaustion and then running them over. Now, Wyoming already had barbaric laws in place. In 85% of the state, wolves are designated as predators, which are shootable on sight. In the remaining 15% of the state, they're trophy game, so they're hunted in other seasons of the year. And in Wyoming, they also allow wolves to be run over by snowmobiles. In fact, a few years ago, a Democratic state legislator tried to introduce a bill to stop that practice, but the bill didn't even get a hearing. So from the very start of wolf reintroduction in the Northern Rockies, Idaho has set the bar as low as could be. First of all, the state refused to even allow its own state wildlife agency to co-manage wolves with the federal government when wolves were reintroduced. So the Nez Perce tribe stepped up and they co-managed Idaho's wolves with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service from 1995 through 2011. And then in the early 2000s, the Idaho legislature developed a state wolf plan. Mind you, I just said the legislature, not even the state agency, the legislature developed their state wolf plan. And on the very first page, the Idaho Wolf Plan cites to House Memorial Resolution 5, which was passed by the House in 2001 and states that it's the official policy of Idaho that wolves should be removed by all means necessary. Then when Congress stripped wolves of protection in Idaho and Montana in 2011, then the state replaced the Nez Perce tribe with their own biologists and immediately instituted wolf hunting and trapping seasons. And since then, the wolf hunting regulations have expanded every year, where, when, and how wolves could be killed. We've seen the worst of it in the last 2 years, however, and yet, some Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife staff and other outside commentators have set Idaho as the standard we need to beat. This is such a low bar. It's really disappointing to see Washington sink that low. Instead, Washington should be looking at California as a model. California State Endangered Species Act is one of the most protective state endangered species acts in the country. It generally doesn't allow killing of state-listed species except in defense of human life. The California Fish and Wildlife Agency and the Commission, they also are really cognizant that the overwhelming majority of the public in California supports wolves, supports wildlife, and wants their wildlife left alive. Sometimes they make the wrong decisions. Sometimes they bow to political pressure in California, but ultimately, for the most part, especially with wolves, the Commission even overruled its own agency and listed wolves under the State Endangered Species Act when the agency said, please don't. And they did that because they understood that the science and the law pointed to that. So that's an example we should be looking at, not Idaho.
Yeah, Claire, it seems like Washington really has the tools here to succeed. Why aren't they using them?
I think that's right, Sam, and I can say I'm from Idaho. So I can say I'm ashamed of how my home state is behaving with regard to wildlife in general, but especially wolves. And I have very high hopes for my adoptive state of Washington because we have all the tools here in Washington that should enable us to be a national leader in wolf management and wolf policy.
Claire, we lost you. You're on mute.
Not sure what happened there. Sorry. Washington shouldn't fall victim to all of the old tropes and fears and superstitions that often lead to the mismanagement of wolves and the killing of them unnecessarily. We have a Washington public that's very progressive and supportive of wolves in the state. We have relatively little, especially compared to other Western states, influence of the livestock lobby that is pushing hard for wolves to be exterminated in other Western states. And we have a supportive governor who's asked for more. Notably, in 2020, he ordered the State Fish and Wildlife Commission to develop a wolf rule to better protect wolves and to not allow to decrease the number of wolves that the taxpayers pay to have gunned down every year. And I think let's just think about that wolves are an endangered species in Washington. They're still on the endangered species list. They're far from meeting the benchmarks for recovery. And yet still the taxpayers pay for their wildlife department to purposefully kill them each year. That's just a crying shame. It's not supported by any need or by the science. And I think Washington can do a whole lot better. I really hope to see us do much better in the coming year.
Yeah, and let's take a step back too for a second, because wolves came back to Washington, returned naturally in the early 2000s. How did Washington first respond to wolves before we ended up here?
Yeah, so Sam, just a little slight more background for folks who haven't followed, the original history of wolves here. I think that it was not since the 1940s that there had been a breeding pair confirmed in Washington. There'd be random sightings over the years, and I think in the 70s there was maybe one sighting of a wolf family, and then they kind of disappeared, and that wasn't even necessarily confirmed. But then, as you said, it was in 2008, 2009, 2010, we began to see our first packs, the Lookout Pack, the Diamond Pack, the Salmo Pack. Unfortunately, almost the entire Lookout Pack was poached not too long after they were discovered. Fortunately, the people who were responsible for that were actually apprehended and prosecuted and convicted, which is very different from what we're seeing with most other wolf poachings that take place in the state. But so with wolves starting to come in and these packs developing, starting in 2007, the staff who work in the Endangered Species Program for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife began to hold public meetings around the state to talk about wolves, to get people's input on wolves and what they might want to see in a wolf conservation and management plan. They also assembled a stakeholder group. I think there were 17 people in that group, and they represented basically three interests: the environmental advocacy interests, the livestock industry's interests, and then the sports hunting group interests, even though, of course, Washington is made up of a much broader swath of people from all walks of life. But that was the group that they put together. And they developed a state wolf plan. And because it was crafted by the Endangered Species Division staff, and because it was so full of current science, it really was the most progressive state wolf plan that had been crafted to date. This plan was adopted by the Fish and Wildlife Commission, which oversees the agency. They adopted the plan in 2011, but several events happened around the same time that would kind of set the course for how wolves would be managed in Washington, regardless of having this otherwise really good plan. So first of all, the commission came out with a position statement telling the agency to immediately start working on a post-state delisting wolf plan. And from this, we can tell that the commission was really anxious to get wolf recovery moved along as quickly as possible so protections could be lifted and wolves could be managed like other wildlife. And then secondly, and probably the most impactful for how we've seen wolves being managed now, the second thing that happened was that oversight for wolves and for the implementation, the actual putting into place of that state wolf plan, that was taken away from their endangered species staff, and it was handed over to the folks in their game management division. And I probably don't need to elaborate that if you're looking at a species through the eyes of an endangered species manager versus a game management manager, you look at the animal very differently, and you might decide how you're going to solve problems very differently. So as I said, the wolf plan was a very good plan, but unlike Oregon's state wolf plan, the Washington plan did not specify that the commission should adopt any enforceable rules about how any of the plans should be implemented, and especially not about how livestock wolf conflict would be addressed, or whether or when wolves could be killed for livestock conflicts. And so it wasn't long before the state agency began to yield to special interest group pressure. So in the summer of 2012, 7 of the 8-member wedge pack was killed on behalf of the Diamond M Ranch for predations which took place on both public and private lands. There was huge public outrage, and in response to that, the department then quickly assembled another stakeholder group called the Wolf Advisory Group. And they assembled this group in 2013, even though the Wolf Plan, when it was adopted 2 years before, had said that the department should put together such a group right away. Then, despite having the Wolf Advisory Group, the department was still kind of going its own way. And in summer of 2014, it undertook a secret wolf kill operation without even notifying the public to kill members of the Huckleberry Pack. And even though they said they would be very sure not to kill any of the breeding members of the pack, the first wolf that was killed was the female wolf. And this was for conflicts that occurred on public lands where a sheep owner was grazing sheep but had no one to watch over the sheep because the sheep herder quit. There was enormous public outrage again, as you can imagine. And at that point, the department was advised by the conservation community they had to develop rules. What they should do was hire a mediator and have the mediator work with outside groups and work with the Wolf Advisory Group members to develop rules that could be adopted by the commission that would say how these conflicts should be managed. But instead, the department hired a facilitator. And if you don't know too much about mediation, arbitration, facilitation, they're all very different things from each other. And instead, they used the facilitator to help the Wolf Advisory Group come up with an unenforceable protocol that would guide how the department responded to livestock wolf conflicts. And the department relied on that protocol that was developed in 2016 and subsequent revisions of the protocol that occurred in 2017 and afterwards to destroy the Profanity Peak Pack, the Sherman Pack, the OPT Pack, the next Wedge Pack that had come into a habitat territory that the old Wedge Pack had had, and many other individual wolves since then. So unfortunately, the department's use of the Wolf Advisory Group to develop a protocol turned it into a document that the group members could live with, as opposed to a guiding document that was optimal for wolves recovery. It doesn't hold the agency or livestock owners accountable to use non-lethal methods before wolves are killed. It does not require full transparency by the agency so that the public can see that staff within the department were having disagreements on whether or not non-lethal methods were used or used effectively. And we know about those arguments and disagreements because our groups have submitted Public Records Act requests and gotten notes from their meetings, but the public doesn't know about this. The protocol also doesn't apply the best available science, which concludes that there's no evidence to support that killing wolves reduces conflicts over the long haul, and that the evidence shows that the best means to reduce conflicts over the long haul is through the use of non-lethal conflict methods. None of this is surprising because the department is opposed to enacting rules that will hold them accountable. And it's not surprising also because social science shows that if you put a group of people together and you have them make decisions based on a consensus process, that's actually the best way to maintain the status quo. If you want change, consensus processes, what people can live with is not the way to make change. Yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Claire, but that's kind of a history of how we got from there to here.
Yeah, I guess I would just add, going back to the question about how we're managing wolves, that, the protocol, as you pointed out, under which we manage wolves, certainly leaves a lot to be desired, having been developed under the compromise process. But I would say even the conditions of the protocol, we could do a lot worse than having those conditions actually enshrined in a rule. Every lawsuit that I've brought against the department for killing wolves has been as a result of their failure to follow even the basic qualifications in the protocol. Maybe the most egregious was in 2019 with the OPT pack. And if you remember, the protocol requires at least 2 non-lethal measures to have been employed before the department will consider lethal removal. In this case, there were none. And once we got the court records, which we get a little bit faster than when we do a public records request, it was clear that there had been no non-lethal measures. And the department simply was dishonest about that to the public. The internal records confirmed that there had never been meaningful range riding on this landscape, that Diamond M Ranch in this case had been offered free range riders and had refused to allow department range riders to protect their cattle because it was concerned that the department range riders would notice violations of their grazing lease and turn them into the federal authorities for violating their federal grazing lease. The records also confirmed that cattle were routinely left out injured, that carcasses were not picked up, that calves were left for weeks with egregious injuries because nobody was watching the calves or protecting them. And it confirmed what we've seen happen over and over again, which is that the cattle were right on top of a wolf rendezvous site, and the livestock owner didn't bother to go through the effort to move them away from the wolf rendezvous site, even though he knew that wolves would kill cattle, that wolves would kill his cattle as a result. So if the department was actually enforcing its protocol, I think we would be in a different situation. But at best, what we see is that it gives it lip service and just sees it as a bunch of boxes that it needs to check to get to lethal removal. And at worst, it simply ignores it and then lies about it. One of the most notable documents that we discovered in the OPT litigation was the notes from a January 2019 meeting in which the internal wolf group was discussing their dissatisfaction about the decision to kill the OPT pack. And it said that leadership had made a political promise to kill OPT wolves, and biologists were being asked to make biological opinions to cover for political decisions. That makes it abundantly clear that what we're really dealing with here is management by special interests, not management by biologists, and not even management according to this protocol, which, inadequate as it is, would be a whole lot better than what we have now if they actually followed it.
Yeah, and it seems like we've had these series of failing protocols, but we've never had any real rules. And that's really seems to have done a disservice, to the public, to the producers who aren't getting really accurate information and support from the department, and to wolves. I just see it as kind of a fail across the board. Have there been no rules ever for wolves in Washington?
There haven't, Sam. As I previously described, the wolf plan itself never recommended or required that any rules be adopted, even though logically they should have developed rules to implement the plan. One of the reasons you do that is because personnel changes. I don't think anybody expected the whole wolf management authority to be shifted from the Endangered Species Division over to their Game Management Division. But even if you didn't account for that happening, personnel change, wolf policy leads change. And you can't just have things change because people have changed. People have different opinions. You need to have those enforceable rules in place so that there's some continuity. Instead of doing that, though, the department had this facilitated WAG process, deciding by consensus what should go into this protocol. And what that usually has meant is that the wolf advocates in the group yields to what the livestock representatives want or what the hunter representatives want. Although, we're not yet at dealing with having to combat the potential for wolves being hunted in Washington, but very often in stakeholder groups, and it's been the case in this group, the livestock industry and the sports hunting reps often vote in a block. And so when there are consensus decisions made, you often have livestock reps and sports hunting reps deciding one way and the advocacy groups yielding to what it is that they want. And then the department, they avoid rules because it holds them accountable. It makes them have to be accountable for the very things that Claire just described they haven't been accountable for. And then the latest excuse is that it would open them up to lawsuits to have rules in place. And we've heard this not just from the department, but we've heard it from the commission. And the thing about that is it's so extraordinarily wrong. it's just the opposite. And Oregon is a perfect example of that. So the Oregon Wolf Plan and rules to implement the plan were adopted together when the plan was adopted in 2005. And from 2005 until the present, only one lawsuit has been filed against the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife for failing to follow the rules that accompany the Wolf Plan. That lawsuit was filed in 2011 when the agency failed to document if non-lethals were being used before they resorted to killing wolves. And at that point, the lawsuit was filed, an injunction was obtained to stop them from killing wolves until the lawsuit could be heard in court or settled. The case was settled 2 years later. During that time, the agency couldn't kill wolves, and livestock owners weren't allowed to kill wolves, and instead they had to work together to implement non-lethal measures. And as a result, the wolf population increased, but conflicts with livestock actually decreased during that same period. That's the only suit. The agency has been sued in Oregon for prematurely removing wolves from the state endangered species list, but it has not been sued more than that one time for having rules in place. And that's because rules give everybody a platform of expectation. You know what the rules are, the public knows what they are, the agency knows what they are, the livestock producers know what they are. You know what the expectations are, that unlike the protocol, which simply sets expectations, when you have a rule, those expectations have to be met. And so it leads to this accountability and enforceability. It brings the hysteria down because people know how things are going to play out and how they should play out.
Yeah, and it does definitely feel like, hunters and livestock interests, have undue influence on this whole process. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on this year, Claire?
Well,
how do we avoid the rule?
I'll maybe back up a little bit too, just to say that, as the lawyer, I think maybe exclusively who has sued the Washington Department over its wolf management over the last few years, it's absolutely ridiculous to say that a rule would lead to more lawsuits. I really agree with Amaroq that it would lead to fewer and probably none if we assume that the agency is going to follow its rule. The lawsuits that we filed have been because there isn't a binding rule, because we're left to argue to the court that the agency's conduct was arbitrary and capricious and that they didn't follow their internal policies. And there's no concrete rule that we can look at, that everyone can look at, as Amaroq said, that sets expectations, that the agency has to do these things before it can kill wolves. With that sort of concrete rule in place, as long as the agency followed it, people within the agency would know what to expect. Wolf advocates would know what to expect. Livestock owners would know what to expect. And there wouldn't be any reason for a lawsuit. I think a more fundamental issue is that the commission really has a responsibility to the people to enact a rule for wolf management. Agencies are not democratic. They're not accountable to the people for their decisions. The way we hold agencies accountable is through rules that are enforceable through potential legal action, because we know that these are the rules that the agency has to follow. The commission just has a responsibility to the public to have that kind of accountability for the department, to make sure that it's being transparent and to enforce minimal standards for its conduct, especially when the department is engaged in repeated actions to kill an endangered species. And I think, Sam, if you wanted to, you wanted to talk about what's happening this year. So I went on.
I really did. I just think, the actual numbers for this year of wolves dying seems bad. I mean, in order to defeat a rule here, they talked about how great the state was doing, and that was often in comparison to Idaho, that we know is doing terrible. How do we compare that in other states, and where are they actually killing wolves and why?
Well, first off, I would say let's not compare it to other states, because that's as Amaroq explained at the outset, that sets a very low bar for Washington because very few states are managing wolves well, California maybe being the exception. That doesn't excuse Washington managing wolves badly. And I think the department arguing against the rule, but was fortunate that the rule came up for consideration fairly early this spring because it's looking to be a remarkably bad year for Washington's wolves if you look at all the numbers. And you're right, one of the arguments that they made in defeating the rule that was considered by the commission earlier this year was, we're doing so well, we are a success story. Now that we've finally gotten over the hump and we're such a success story, why would you interfere with that and enact a rule? And we've seen in the months since then exactly why we need a rule. The last count in the state was 206 wolves at the start of the year. We know that at least 10 wolves have been killed by poaching, poisoning up in the Wedge Pack, the northern part of Stevens County, which we hear wiped out basically the entire Wedge Pack at the beginning of the year. We know that 3 have been killed by management actions by the department and counting, with an open kill order against the Lead Point Pack right now and several other packs in danger. Most recently, the department killed a wolf pup belonging to the wrong pack when it was trying to execute a kill order against the Smackout Pack. It accidentally killed a wolf pup from the Dirty Shirt Pack. That tells you exactly how random the department's actions are. 4 to 5 wolves, I think 5 wolves have been killed and counting in what they call caught in the act shootings so far this year. That's supposed to be a shooting by a livestock owner that is found justifiable by the department because the livestock owner actually catches the wolves in the act of attacking his cattle. What we've seen is that very rarely are wolves killed in this manner actually in the act of attacking cattle. And caught in the act shooting should be extremely rare. Instead, we've had, I think, 5 so far this year and 3 just in July.
And Claire, wasn't someone actually leaving out carcasses and then caught a wolf in the act there and killed the wolf over dead cows?
Yeah, we don't have all the facts about that, although we've put in a public disclosure request, but it will be many months before the department actually complies with that request. But what we know is that a producer, I think a dairy producer in the Stranger Pack territory, had open carcass pits, multiple open carcass pits for years that the department knew about, that the department had not done anything about, although I understand there was an effort some time ago to try to cover the open carcass pits. And the department knew that the Stranger Pack wolves were hanging out around these carcass pits. They could see the wolf collar data that's where the wolves were all the time because they were just feeding on the carcasses from this livestock owner. And things really came to a head when in July there was a caught in the act shooting by, I don't know, but perhaps the same livestock owner in the same area as these carcass pits. And there was talk that the department was considering killing some of the Stranger Pack wolves as well because they'd become acclimated to people because they'd been hanging out by the carcasses so long. I mean, that is, I suspect that when we get the full story on the Stranger Pack, it is going to be a startling example of mismanagement, but we're left to piece it together because the department isn't saying much publicly. But anyway, continuing with what the numbers look like this year, we also have an unknown number of wolves who are going to be killed by a tribal hunt or have already been killed by a legal tribal hunt. It was 22 last year. Adding all those numbers together, we're looking like we're on track to kill about 20%, that humans are on track to kill about 20% of the state wolf population on purpose this year. And that's a startling high number. I mean, you're getting up to numbers of other despicable Western states at that point, and it could get a whole lot worse with several more packs that may be subject to lethal removal orders before the season's over.
Yeah, and I've heard, from commissioners and from folks across, across the line too, that, we've only killed 38 wolves in Washington. Why does that number matter? Why is that so much? If I'm a contrarian and I'm on the other side, can you talk to me a bit about the 38 wolves in the past 10 years and what's wrong with that? And are wolves still recovering?
Yeah, I sure can. Killing wolves isn't the answer. All that is caving in to hysteria. It's caving into special interests. The department contends that killing wolves is going to result in wolves changing their behavior and stop killing livestock. And they've come up with, I don't know, Claire, 5 different variations of how they've said that over the years, and they kept changing it all the time. But for instance, they maintain that if they kill some members of a wolf pack, that means there's going to be fewer mouths to feed, and so the wolves will stop killing livestock, even though there's no scientific evidence which supports that claim. And in fact, when they have killed wolves whose packs were involved in conflicts, the conflicts continued. So with the Togo pack back in 2018, this wolf family consisted of a mother wolf, a father wolf, and 2 4-month-old pups. When they killed the father wolf, the female kept killing livestock. And perhaps that was because it was now even harder for her to kill wild prey on her own as the only adult in the pack left. With the OPT pack in 2019, this wolf family consisted of 8 members at that time. When they killed the father, more wolves, more conflicts occurred. And there are many, many other examples over the years, but the common factor in them is that insufficient or no non-lethal deterrents were used. Range riders were not used when they should have been, or if they were there, instead of being out with the cattle in the field, in the forest, on their horses, they were simply riding along on the roads in their trucks, looking for cattle or wolves, or tracking down wolf collar data and looking for clusters and then finding dead cattle instead of monitoring the cattle to protect them. Cattle, as Claire said, carcasses that died and weren't removed. We've seen reports where the agency noted that there was a cattle that appeared to have died trapped in some downfall trees and had been there for a long time. And in fact, I think they found it because the odor was so overwhelming. And if it's overwhelming to a person, you can imagine what an attractant that would be to a wolf or other predator. The instances of salt blocks not being removed that were near rendezvous sites or den sites. What you were just describing, Claire, reminded me of going back to 2016 with the Profanity Peak Pack in terms of what the agency told us and what was actually done or not done. The report that came out of the Profanity Peak Pack said that once it was discovered that the salt blocks were near the wolf den and rendezvous site, the salt blocks were removed. That's not what happened. Following our Public Records Act request and probably possibly with a lawsuit, I don't remember if we filed a suit by then. I don't think we had a Public Records Act request revealed that the salt blocks, which were known to be right near where the wolves den and rendezvous sites were not moved for 5 weeks. They were not moved until 3 weeks after it was already known that the wolves and cattle were mixing it up together, not until several weeks after the first wolf attacks on livestock had occurred, and not until, I think it was three days after the agency had started to trap wolves to kill them. And the only reason that the salt block was removed is that they were afraid that the cattle would get caught in the wolf traps. And yet the information that had been told to the public was, we did this right away. So the problem isn't that one that we need to solve by killing wolves. The problem is one that needs to be solved by using non-lethal deterrents and using them proactively before conflicts begin with. So yeah, okay, 38 wolves over 10 years. We don't know how many wolves have also been illegally poached because of the failure of the department to do honest to God public coexistence education. And one of the ways they could do that education is to demonstrate that they don't need to kill wolves to solve conflicts, but to instead demonstrate that by using non-lethal deterrent measures, we'll have the best success of not having these conflicts to begin with.
Yeah, Amaroq, I would, again, I agree with everything that you've said, and recalling some of the things that the department has said in its rationale for killing wolves. I mean, they're just ludicrous on their face. I mean, the most recent rationale is that killing wolves will change pack behavior, basically teach them a lesson so they don't kill cattle anymore. And, that goes something like this, that, weeks after wolves have had a meal that happened to consist of cattle, someone in a helicopter shoots a different wolf, perhaps miles away, and that's supposed to teach the whole pack a lesson not to eat cattle anymore. Anybody who has a dog knows how ridiculous that is. Animals don't learn that way. Wolves have no idea why someone from a helicopter suddenly killed the pack. And because that doesn't work, we see repeated conflicts in the same area year after year, because this is a people problem, not a wolf problem. And then the department, pretends that its hand has been forced and that, all right, I guess the wolves didn't learn their lesson when we killed just one or two of them. So unfortunately, we have to go kill the whole pack. And then even that doesn't work. It works for a short time because the whole pack is gone. But generally, these are really attractive areas for wolves to live. So packs move back. And because the same people are still there with the same mismanagement, the same problems, the problem will start again the next year. And just a failure to protect cattle, a failure to do common sense things to avoid conflict. It's now become just routine. The department doesn't even bother to lie about it anymore, in its records, that salt blocks are left by rendezvous sites and den sites. And 2016, it was shocking when we discovered that. But now it's not even shocking. It's just routine. It's not expected that livestock producers will move their cattle off of den sites or rendezvous sites, even though we know, and we've seen just by our own experience in this state, that that's where most of the conflicts occurs, very close to these wolf population areas. But there's not even an expectation that livestock producers will move their cattle away from these population areas. We know that cattle are left routinely out in the mountains over the winter, stranded in several feet of snow, just to serve as bait for wolves and attract, wolves to the area where cattle will be grazing the next season. And I think it's really important to look at where these wolves are being killed. And for what sort of conflicts, because by and large, it's not because of conflicts on privately owned land or because they're killing cattle, next to the farmhouse, or cattle that are being watched over carefully by the livestock owners. 90%, close to 90% of the wolves that have been killed in the state have been killed due to conflicts on public land, and specifically the wild forests in the Colville National Forest, which if you've ever been there or seen pictures, are densely forested, steep, wooded, treacherous areas even for a horse to go, much less for wolves to be, for cattle to be wandering around. It's wolf country. It's not cattle country. But livestock owners will turn cattle out into these enormous grazing allotments, over the summer with no human interaction. Also, it's important to remember that 75% of the wolves that we've killed in this state, that the department has killed in the state, have been for a single livestock owner, Diamond M. And I think it's important to keep in mind what Diamond M's thought process is about protecting their cattle. And, this is a quote that we used in the OPT suit. Diamond M said to the media once, one of the Diamond M proprietors, the idea of protecting our cattle is ridiculous, especially in mountains, often in heavy timber and rough country. There are many cows we won't see all summer long. As long as that is the attitude toward cattle management in wolf country, these problems aren't going away, and the department will be killing the same packs year after year after year.
And I definitely hear that. You know, I recently read an article where one of the range riding organizations that's sponsored by cattle producers of Washington, one of their range riders actually said if they saw a wolf, they would shoot it. And that was in a newspaper article. So it seems like we're not really solving these issues here. How does a rule get to the solution for this problem?
Amaroq, do you want to take that one, or I can start?
Go ahead.
I think we've already talked about a little bit of this, but a rule solves this problem because it sets expectations for the public, for the department, for livestock owners, and it's something that we can hold the department to. Hopefully, one of those expectations that it sets is transparency. Being honest with the public, and that solves a lot of problems just on its own.
And what does that transparency and accountability look like, Claire?
I think it looks like an obligation for the department to report certain things to the public before it takes action to kill wolves, and an obligation to share the sort of information that we have to either sue the department for at this point, or wait 6 months to a year, sometimes longer, to get through public records requests. So the department has to report certain things to the public before it kills wolves, and so that the public can follow along with what's happening, and hold the department to the rule and hold the department accountable for what its actions are. A rule can do that. The department isn't doing that now. And the department now is free to be dishonest with the public. And, we might catch it a year or two later, but there's no accountability for that. There's no responsibility for that.
And Amaroq, how do you see a rule, working to solve this really complicated, long-lasting situation?
We need standards that are informed by science, which focus on non-lethal management. And I'm going to kind of segue there into the science again, and I mentioned it in passing, I'll say it again. The best available science concludes that there's no evidence support that killing wolves reduces conflicts over the long haul. In fact, I can think of several papers, including one that the department uses, which basically says that if you wipe out an entire wolf pack, yeah, you won't have conflicts, but a year or two later, when a new wolf pack moves in, if none of the animal husbandry practices have been changed to actively protect your livestock, you're going to have conflicts all over again. That's the classic definition of insanity, right? It's also the classic definition of expensive, because the department goes in and kills a whole wolf pack. The helicopter costs and the crew costs and all of that are pretty extensive, in the tens of thousands of dollars, maybe even over 100,000 in one case. The evidence shows that the best means to reduce conflict over the long haul is through the use of non-lethal measures. Several methods in particular have been found through evidence-based research to be effective. Those include fencing, the use of livestock guarding dogs, and then fladry. That's the red cord stuff that gets hung on fence lines that wolves don't like to cross. And experts who've worked in the field for decades in the US and also in Europe, where they never wiped out their wolves. And so livestock owners there have lived with wolves in a number of countries all along. They find that the most effective methods for livestock conflict deterrence involves changes in livestock husbandry practices. Livestock ownership, livestock operators, it's a business. And what's the first rule of staying in business? You change with the times. Well, the times, they are a-changing. The wolves are coming back, and the people want the wolves back, and nature wants the wolves back, because wolves are really good for the rest of nature. So the times, they are changing. It's time to change livestock husbandry practices to be able to live with them instead of killing them.
Yeah, it seems like time should have changed 10 years ago. And if they can't change 10 years ago, today is a good place to start. Claire, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I mean, the reasons that time hasn't changed is because the state government is not demanding that livestock owners change their method of doing business now that wolves and other predators are back on the landscape. I think it's important to keep all of this in perspective, that livestock losses to wolves are really very, very small. And a study in Washington a few years ago, I think, found less than 1% of livestock were lost to wolves. And just the insanity of spending sometimes upward of $100,000 to kill the wolves, that we're also spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to help recover in the state, all over a few $1,000s of losses to livestock owners, which are compensated under a different state program. There are solutions to conflict. I don't know that conflict can ever be brought to zero, but I think we need to be sensible about resetting our perceptions and our expectations, and realize that far more livestock are lost out on these allotments to other causes than will ever be killed by wolves. And we need to factor that in as a part of turning livestock out unsupervised over these massive allotments every summer.
And I do want to be cognizant of time too, but we had a good audience question that might be a good follow-up. Is it even possible to protect cattle in public land areas like the Colville, where the cows are spread out? Is that even a possibility?
Amaroq, I'll maybe turn that one over to you, because I've heard conflicting things from experts about that.
Yeah. I think what I'll say is, number one, it probably depends on the landscape, because I know, for instance, that in Montana, there is some very well working, active range riding livestock husbandry practices that are going on, that are being so successful in preventing any conflicts between livestock and wolves, but also between livestock and grizzly bears. And they've had great success in doing that. And they're able to do that across vast, vast landscapes, because they know their cattle, they're with them all the time. They've worked with them to change their behavior so that it's what's called low stress livestock handling. Those of us who grew up watching Westerns on TV, you see all this fast riding and slapping your horse and wrangling your lasso and stuff. That's just the opposite of what cattle need. Cattle need to be mellow so that they can be present and aware of their surroundings, and so they can protect their offspring and be in a group area together, bunched up, so that they're more like a wild ungulate herd, where they bunch up to protect themselves. And through livestock husbandry practices, this can happen. Can this happen in some place like Washington, where you've got this really, really rugged terrain that Claire is describing? Claire and I were out there together a few years ago, and it's just astonishing to think that cattle are being expected to make a living, to forage in an area which has so little nutrition for them. You see why the livestock owners there are spreading their cattle out, because there isn't one place where they can get the nutrition that they need. The problem is that the more spread out they are, the more susceptible they are to being attacked by not just wolves, cougars, bears, calves could be attacked by coyotes, all kinds of predators, or injuries. The amount of downfall trees in those public lands where cattle are being grazed in Northeast Washington is really stunning too. They're like safety traps for livestock. They get in the middle of some downfall trees. There's no way they can escape. So it's a difficult landscape. I still believe that things that should have been tried haven't been tried. For instance, you can't call it range riding if people are riding around in their trucks in accessory roads and not out there in the thick of it where the cattle are. So I have some hope that some measures could still be taken if people had the willpower to do it, and if the agency could enforce it. And if it can't be done, then something new needs to be tried. Something new needs to be tried.
Yeah, I would say, Amaroq, I'm certainly no expert on this issue, but before we throw up our hands and say we failed and it can't be done, let's at least try. And no matter what the department says, we haven't really tried in Washington. And if it's absolutely impossible to protect livestock in a certain area, then maybe we need to rethink whether it makes sense to have livestock grazing in that area, but there are some indications that they can be protected. One good example is, 2 years that the OPT pack had conflicts, 2018 and 2019. It had its den site on a separate allotment. There were no conflicts, there were no dead cattle on that allotment where, I understand there was, some pretty good range riding and protection of cattle, but as soon as the wolves moved their rendezvous site, the wolves had their den site on another allotment. As soon as the wolves moved their rendezvous site to the Diamond M allotment, the conflicts started because there was no range riding. There was no attempt to protect the cattle. That's at least a sign that it's possible even in the Colville National Forest.
Yeah, and I've been encouraged by the operations that do it well. The unfortunate thing is that they often don't speak up. They kind of tend to their business, and everything's working well for them too because they're implementing non-lethals that are really effective. I did want to close, we've got a couple minutes left here. What's the feasibility of us actually achieving a rule or something along the lines of a rule for wolves?
I'll say just on your last point, Sam, one thing that the department says that I think is true is that there are a lot of success stories in Washington. There are a lot of livestock owners that are doing a good job. We don't hear about them because there aren't conflicts there, because wolves aren't killed as a result of conflicts on their allotments. And I don't mean to take away from, the fact that a lot of livestock owners obviously are doing a good job at preventing conflict. It's the exceptions and the department's failure to respond appropriately to those exceptions that creates the problem that we have. Going back to your question, I think that a good rule protecting wolves is absolutely achievable, but we need to have some public pressure to make that happen. There are 3 seats coming up vacant on the commission at the end of this year. And we're hoping at least 2 of those seats, we see new commissioners. And I think that the public needs to demand that Governor Inslee appoint commissioners who will support the wolf rule that he has ordered the commission to pass and that will, protect this state endangered species. If the public doesn't show up, the public doesn't make that demand, I think things will continue much as they have.
I'll just second what Claire said. It is entirely possible with public pressure. We're so close now. The commission has already changed dramatically. It needs to change more. It needs to be a commission that reflects the science that exists and reflects the will of the public.
2 more good commissioners would make a world of difference on many fronts, and wolf rule is one of them.
Okay, I'm going to close with one last question. I'm you a magic wand in this question. In this magic wand, you can change one thing about how wolves are managed in Washington. What would you change and why? In the absence of a rule, we're going to say no rule. So what would you change and why?
That the department is honest with the public, because I think if the public knows what is actually going on, and if the department is honest and transparent, that providing that information to the public, sort of the rest will follow. We shouldn't have to fight this hard to find out what our government is up to.
And I guess I'll say I wish that Washington, if I had a magic wand, I wish that Washington had a state Endangered Species Act that was as protective as California's, because then the agency and the livestock operators would need to learn to coexist with wolves through measures that don't involve killing wolves, but instead engage human creativity and initiative that follow the science and that respect the intrinsic value of wolves, because this would also effectuate an understanding that has been expressed from many great moral leaders in the world. From Gandhi, who said the greatness of a nation can be judged by how its animals are treated. And then even from Pope Francis. And this is where I think humans can change. Pope Francis said that human beings, while capable of the worst, are also capable of rising above themselves. choosing again what is good and making a new start despite their mental and social conditioning. We can do that. Surely we can do that.
I absolutely think so. And I do see a lot of hope. And I had said this in one of the questions too. You know, I think that we say the strength of the wolf is the pack. The strength of the pack is the wolf. And we need our pack to show up at commission meetings. We need you to show up in comments. All commission meetings are hybrid now. So you can comment virtually at commission meetings. You can let commissioners know that we need a rule for wolves. And we certainly are all available to support you in that process if you have questions as well. And we could use a few more good commissioners. That would be a game changer. So thank you all, and thank you to the center for hosting this tonight. And we will be posting this on YouTube tomorrow, the center will, and we'll also be following up as needed. So feel free to reach out to any of us, either at Washington Wildlife First or at the Center for Biological Diversity, and we'll get back to you. And I'm sorry for any questions I didn't answer. I ran out of time, so apologies on that.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you everybody for tuning in.
Thank you, everyone.